A very good afternoon to everybody. My name is Chris Dolan. I'm the director of Refugee Law Project. And we're here partnering with the Irish Centre for Human Rights in a digital dialogue on the occasion of the World Day Against Trafficking in Persons, 30th of July. And we're doing this as part of a larger project on trafficking, which is supported by the Irish Research Council. So this day, or human trafficking rather, let me begin there, is defined by the United Nations Voluntary Trust Fund for Victims of Trafficking as a global multi-billion-dollar enterprise with no country immune. Every year, millions of children, women and men fall victim to traffickers for the purposes of exploitation. This includes prostitution, forced labor, domestic servitude, forced begging, and even organ removal. A crime that shames us all. Human trafficking robs people of their dignity, dreams, and basic human rights. But what does that mean in a pandemic landscape? We just recently published a joint policy brief in which it was highlighted that the measures adopted in response to COVID-19 have contributed to reducing the spread of the virus, but they also carry negative consequences that have disproportionately affected the most vulnerable in our society, including victims and survivors of human trafficking and other exploited persons. Economic activity at global, regional, local levels have been significantly affected, resulting in widespread loss of livelihood and income. And these resulting effects from the pandemic carry the risk of exacerbating the vulnerabilities of persons already at risk of human trafficking. So we have that by way of background, and linked to the COVID-19 background, we have this year's focus, which is, I guess, coming from our new awareness of the importance of first responders. But the focus of this year is to look at what does it mean for first responders as well. Those people who are working in different sectors, identifying, supporting, counseling, and seeking justice for victims of trafficking, and challenging the impunity of the traffickers. So you can see there's a lot to discuss, and we're very privileged today to have three panelists, all of whom are involved in tackling that impunity of traffickers, and each of whom brings a very different experience and angles to bear on our discussion on human trafficking in a pandemic landscape, implications for children and forced migrants. We're looking forward to a mixture of very context-specific insights, connected and situated to the broader patterns of trafficking and responses to trafficking, as well as looking at what are some of the policy asks that should be highlighted on this International Day. So we have the three panelists. I'd like to begin just by introducing the first panelist, Rachel Bikhole. Rachel was the first in her family to study law. She got her first degree from Makerere and later on obtained an Irish Aid Fellowship and was able to pursue an LL.M. in International Criminal Law at the National University of Ireland, Galway, some years ago now, 2012 to 2013, and then returned to the Directorate of Public Prosecutions to work on international crimes. So our first speaker, Rachel, is currently an Assistant Director of Public Prosecutions and the coordinator of the Anti-Trafficking in Persons Department in the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. Uganda is currently placed on Tier 2 watch list rating on the recently released 2020 USA Trafficking in Persons report. That's a tier that is reserved for countries that do not meet the minimum standards of the United States Trafficking Victims Protection Act, but are making efforts to do so. As head of the Anti-Trafficking in Persons Department, can you please tell us how prevalent is this issue of trafficking in persons here in East Africa, particularly Uganda, a host of the largest refugee population on the continent? And how would you say that the steps of first responders seeking to tackle such trafficking nationally and regionally, how have they been impacted, if at all, by COVID-19? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. So today, Uganda joins the rest of the world to commemorate the World Day Against Trafficking in Persons. And the office of the DPP is among the first responders, key responders, and is also a member of the National Task Force Committee for Prevention of Trafficking in Persons. And we are extremely glad today that in addition to commemorating the World Day Against Trafficking in Persons, we have also launched the National Action Plan and the National Referral Guidelines for Management of Victims of Trafficking in Uganda. So the National Action Plan sets out the strategic activities of each institution in combating trafficking over the next 5 years, while the National Referral Guidelines are supposed to help us in streamlining the referral of victims of trafficking, right from the time of their rescue throughout the system, throughout the process when they go through the justice system. Chris has already given a brief on what trafficking is, but currently in Uganda, I'll focus my discussion on the Ugandan perspective. The principal legislation in Uganda that governs trafficking in persons is the Prevention of Trafficking in Persons Act that was enacted in 2009. It's been 11 years now since this act came into existence. So, and TIP in Uganda is governed by the 4 Ps, that's prevention, protection, partnership, and prosecution. So the Office of the DPP, being among the first respondents, is the lead agency for prosecution. And as such, we have embarked on a number of activities aimed at combating trafficking in persons, but also to ensure that we come out from the downgraded list of Tier 2 watch list back to the watch list. Some of the few, rather back to Tier 2 and probably Tier 1, who knows. So we have embarked on a few activities that include creation of the office of the coordinator for trafficking in persons in the office of the DPP to foresee all cases of trafficking in persons in the country. And in addition, we have begun on robust trainings, capacity building through conducting regional trainings in all the field stations. And in each of the field stations, we are appointing a focal person to be in charge of trafficking. This is because we also want to conduct a case census of all trafficking in persons cases under prosecution and those under investigation. The reason why we were downgraded to Tier 2 was that we registered less cases of investigation and also less cases of prosecution. Simply because our statistics were not very accurate. So it is something that we are embarking on robustly. So far, we have registered over 300 cases under investigation only during this COVID-19 pandemic period. And this is a very great effort compared to the 120 cases that registered in the whole of 2019 and 286 cases that registered in 2018. Of course, this demonstrates that we are being aggressive in ensuring work towards achieving more investigations and prosecutions, and then also to ensure that the victims of trafficking get the necessary justice, support, and protection. And then also, we are also ensuring that we really need to leave the Tier 2 watch list. Yeah. So we have also embraced prosecution-led investigations in all trafficking in persons cases. And of course, with prosecution-led investigations, we ensure that the quality of the investigation is up to standard, ensure accurate collection of admissible evidence, and maintaining the integrity of this evidence. We believe that when we embark on prosecution-led investigations, less time is lost by files moving back and forth, the office of the DPP and the police. So that's one of the ways of handling our work more effectively and also efficiently. And as a result of prosecution-led investigations, we have successfully prosecuted cases from Magistrates Court to High Court. And among the cases we have successfully prosecuted in the High Court is the case of Uganda versus Umutoni Anet, and then also Uganda versus Natkunda Faith. These are cases of transnational trafficking that were, the victims in these cases were all sexually exploited. Umutoni Anet had children who were sexually exploited, and then also Natkunda Faith. So these cases were concluded in the High Court, and they were all sentenced to 8 years of imprisonment each. And Natkunda Faith paid, in addition to imprisonment, she had to compensate the victims of trafficking. So these are some of the fruits of prosecution-led investigations that we are registering. Then we have also had increased coordination among the government agencies, various ministries like Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development, Ministry of Internal Affairs, Foreign Affairs, several civil society organizations that have also been actually key in the implementing of the National Action Plan and the National Referral Guidelines, together with international organizations that focus on trafficking in persons. And as a result of this increased coordination, the ODPP has an expert on trafficking in persons from the Human Trafficking Institute that is resident in our office and to help us in our daily work of combating trafficking in persons. So we believe that these efforts are really meant to help us combat trafficking and also ensure that we come out of the Tier 2 watch list. So when we look at the implications of human trafficking in a pandemic landscape, or rather how COVID-19 has impacted on human trafficking in Uganda, we find that the key contributing factors to trafficking in Uganda have been aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Particularly, we have registered there's increased levels of poverty and unemployment in the country. Many youths are unemployed and looking for options to escape their poverty, only for them to end up in the hands of human traffickers. So we find that also sexual and gender-based violence has actually skyrocketed, especially among refugees, among children, victims of forced prostitution, forced marriages, and child marriages. These are some of the issues that we see that have been escalated by the pandemic. So as a result of the pandemic, the borders in Uganda, just like maybe elsewhere, borders and airports have been closed. So we are not seeing the same trend of transnational trafficking in persons because it's more difficult to detect now because they're using underground methods. However, much as there is a decrease in transnational cases of trafficking reported, we realize that most of our victims who are in a trafficking situation are actually stuck with their traffickers. And what does this mean for them? It means they are continuing to be in a situation of exploitation. So this is the challenge that we have. Much as we've registered lowest numbers of transnational trafficking, we believe that the victims there are still being exploited. Those who can't move because of the movement restrictions. Domestically, we have registered an increase of cases of domestic trafficking. I've earlier mentioned that we have so far registered 300 cases under investigation during this COVID-19 period. So some of the factors that have led to the increase in domestic cases, well, is probably now we are giving domestic cases more attention since there's a decrease in transnational cases. And then secondly, children are not in school. Students and children are not in school. So therefore, exploitation is easier with access to vulnerable populations. Then we've seen child marriages on the increase. Just this week, Daily Monitor reported that at least 128 schoolgirls have been married through a forced or arranged marriage during the lockdown. So this is a form of exploitation that we see that is really on the increase. And yet, according to our law, when we talk about aggravated child trafficking, some forms of exploitation include child marriage and forced marriages. And this is a grave offense. And once someone is found guilty, they are liable to suffer death. But it's something that has been contributed to by the poverty, increased levels of poverty in the country, because parents are seeking dowry as a source of revenue. And then we also have cultural practices aimed at eliminating poverty. For instance, we've seen a lot of practicing witchcraft, harmful rituals, and then, of course, these come along with human sacrifice, which is a form of exploitation only unique to Uganda as a country. And then we see increased child labor exploitation through cheap labor, non-paid labor, those working in agriculture and everything, because traffickers are taking advantage of the fact that children are at home and are not in school to exploit them. And then the government.
Rachel, I think I'm going to have to stop you there, if I may.
I just have one or two points, because the government encouraged a lot of internet use during the lockdown. So, and as a result of this increased e-learning, we've seen more access to the internet by youth and children, and this has increased their vulnerability to online exploitation, especially online child sex exploitation. And our capacity to investigate this is rather limited. And of course, the NGOs had difficulties, especially in accessing victims during trafficking. The judicial system was delayed, was slowed down because of the fear of movement in the country. So that also curtailed our efforts a little bit. But then again, we see the government intervention of allowing refugees on humanitarian grounds to come into the country. Of course, with the increase in the number of vulnerable population, like refugees in the country, it means that there's an increased risk to exploitation. And as of today, the government also repatriated over 70 victims of trafficking in persons from the Gulf countries. So we are glad that even during this pandemic, measures are being put in place on humanitarian grounds to ensure that there is assistance and support to victims of trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And I know we had a question from a participant about, can we take the focus off just talking about migrants going to Europe? And I think that your presentation has really helped us to understand what does trafficking look like domestically as well, and how is that also being impacted by the pandemic. And partly there may be changes in patterns of trafficking, partly there are changes in which cases we're able to attend to. So I think your presentation has really set the stage for our next two panelists. So thank you again very much for that. I'd like to turn now to our second panelist, Dr. Eefje de Volder, who is speaking from the Netherlands and is a co-founder and team member of an organization called IMPACT, the Center Against Human Trafficking and Sexual Violence in Conflict. Eefje's doctorate looked at the functioning of collective security system of the African Union. She's also conducted research for a number of regional and international institutions and organizations on human trafficking, has moderated many international dialogues on the same, and taught at many levels, both in the Netherlands and abroad, on the issue of trafficking. She's also a board member of a leading European network of NGOs providing support to trafficked victims and working directly with victims of labor exploitation in the Netherlands. So, Eefje, you're most welcome.
Yes.
And I know you wear both a legal and an anthropological hat. And, I hadn't even mentioned, but you also bring those to bear on co-editing a journal that explores the nexus between human trafficking, enslavement, and conflict-related sexual violence.
Yes.
So with all of that background, and as someone deeply involved in training of first responders, today is the day about first responders in trafficking situations, what do you see as some of the gaps and opportunities in initiatives to prevent and respond to trafficking in persons, particularly if they're already refugees? And have those gaps, have those opportunities changed, or do they need to change as a result of the pandemic?
Yes, thank you very much for this kind introduction and for organizing this timely event, and also welcome very much the attendees and the opportunity to exchange thoughts. So, to your question, I think that actually the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic has acted somehow as a contrast fluid in our societies, actually highlighting the situation of the most vulnerable, circumstances which under normal conditions would be somehow more below the surface or just largely overlooked or even ignored. And in some contexts, we have seen that the COVID-19 pandemic and the national health concerns and risks have had positive effects on dealing with circumstances that enable exploitative practices. So, for example, in some European countries, outbreaks of COVID-19 on workplaces where migrant workers are working mainly have led to reviews of the circumstances that make them vulnerable to exploitation. But overall, we can say that the pandemic have put the most vulnerable even more at risk of trafficking and exploitation. And so their options to actually cushion the effects of the pandemic are already limited from the start. And COVID-19 and the resulting measures to probe it has actually heightened the risk of even more people falling into extreme poverty and making them also less resilient to traffickers. So particularly refugees and including children, I think experience disproportionately the consequences of COVID-19. In many states, their access to support and services has already been constrained due to insufficient resources to address their ever-increasing needs of the growing population that is on the move worldwide. So in the context of Uganda, the brief of actually the Refugee Law Project and the speech of our former speaker has already clearly highlighted the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic for the vast population of refugees that actually Uganda hosts. So mention was made of these shrinking labor markets and rising unemployment and poverty levels that actually force refugees to compete for scarce resources and jobs, even with host communities that even put them more at risk. Also, refugees are confined to settlements, and there have been cuts in their income, in their rations, and also the food rations, which actually leads to a situation where you have poverty, maybe even hunger, no means to supplement income, and this actually makes them more vulnerable to trafficking. And traffickers, on the other hand, make use of this climate of impunity and the despair of vulnerable people that is actually exacerbated by COVID-19. So indeed, COVID-19 has had a disproportional impact on the refugee population. But I think that we must keep in mind that in general, in humanitarian situations, even without a health crisis, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, that trafficking in persons and other forms of exploitation, despite it being serious crimes and involving grave human rights violations, remain largely overlooked in humanitarian response, both by government and non-governmental actors. So why is this particularly the case? Why is trafficking overlooked in these situations? So if you look in humanitarian settings, the focus of the overall protection approach is really on immediate life-saving efforts. And counter-trafficking efforts have not necessarily been understood in this way. So the humanitarian community has at times considered human trafficking as something that should be dealt with more, or is more of a concern of development actors actually. Further, and very important, is that we have no clear definition of exploitation for human trafficking. We don't have it at the international level, it's left to the national jurisdictions. So we have many different manifestations of exploitative practices in humanitarian settings that can be assessed differently. So this is also one of the reasons why we started the Journal on Trafficking, Enslavement, and Conflict-Related Sexual Violence, because we see that there are a lot of similarities between these crimes that we should consider, but at the same time, we should also not overlook the differences. So what you see now is that forms of trafficking in persons might be filed as under sexual or gender-based violence or conflict-related sexual violence, while other forms of trafficking might fall completely between the cracks. And that means that the situation is not assessed how it should be assessed, leading to victims or people at risk not being identified as such, and also not being offered the right support. What is even more important is the lack of legislation actually to reduce vulnerability to trafficking and to protect the needs of at-risk populations. So you see that anti-trafficking legislation focuses still mostly on a criminal justice response and far less on the protection of victims and the prevention and addressing of root causes. And this impacts actually the response in humanitarian situations. And this, in fact, is a consequence of the focus of the Palermo Protocol, the international document that criminalized trafficking in persons and lays down the obligations of states, having a primarily criminal justice focus rather than a focus on the respect of trafficked persons' human rights. And So the protocol does include as its main purpose to protect and assist victims of such trafficking with full respect of their human rights, but the provisions that are actually related to victims are non-binding, including assistance and protection measures. So trafficking should actually be addressed as a human rights and social justice issue, but the focus is much more on repression of transboundary crime rather than on the systematic nature of exploitation in the context of trafficking and addressing its socio-economic root causes. So while there have been efforts regionally and internationally to promote the human rights issue or to the human rights-based approach to trafficking, particularly in Europe, leading to binding obligations, actually. The overall approach by national authorities worldwide remains strongly rooted in the original approach by the Palermo Protocol, with little attention to the human rights dimension. But 2020 is not only momentous because of COVID-19. 2020 marks the 20 years of the Palermo Protocol, which has offered us time to reflect and determine the best way forward. We did this as civil society, along with the outgoing UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, Maria Grazia Marinaro. And we have actually supported her trafficking manifesto with recommendations to move forward, which focus very much on these continuous efforts to put human rights of trafficked persons at the center of all efforts to prevent and combat trafficking and protect and assist victims. Because COVID-19 actually has emphasized the socioeconomic circumstances that are at the root of trafficking and exploitation and need urgent addressing if we want to combat trafficking effectively, particularly among refugees or forced migrants. And similarly, the human rights-based approach would result in identification and support of trafficked persons disconnected from criminal proceedings. In fact, most of the trafficked cases, particularly involving refugees or forced migrants, will not even make it to court. So nowadays you see that they even lack access to support. So me and also other civil society actors are extremely happy with the appointment of the new UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons. And we hope that she will use her mandate to really put the human rights of trafficked persons at the core of anti-trafficking efforts, resulting in better protection and addressing the socio-economic root causes of trafficking, which I think will also be to the benefit of refugees and forced migrants, including children.
Thank you very much, Eefje. I think you're putting the cat among the pigeons to a certain extent. So we've heard a lot about what steps are being taken in Uganda on the prosecution side from our first speaker, Rachel Bikhole. And now you've come and said we need less prosecution, or maybe not less prosecution, but more social justice, more human rights of victims. We need to really look at what do we mean by a victim-centered approach. We need to think about, how fit for purpose is the Palermo Protocol 20 years after it was established. So thank you very much for that, what I think are sometimes called those provocations. We need them, and we need to be helped to think outside the existing boxes. And I think you also began the process of introducing our third speaker, so thank you for that. I'm particularly delighted now to move to our third speaker, Professor Siobhán Mullally, who is an established professor of human rights law and the director of the Irish Centre for Human Rights, with whom we're partnering. And most importantly, for the purposes of this discussion, is the incoming Special Rapporteur, UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. Prior to that, she was a member of the Council of Europe Treaty Monitoring Body, the group of experts on action against trafficking in human beings from 2013 to 19, and served as its president from 2017 to 2019. Professor Mullally is also a commissioner with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission and a member of the National Group of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. So, Professor, you're most welcome, and allow me to also congratulate you in public on your appointment. It's really fantastic news. And we are also very much looking forward to continuing the collaboration with you on the Coalesce project, out of which this particular dialogue has sprung. I think we've already heard from the previous speakers that COVID-19 has quite possibly and almost certainly created new vulnerabilities and aggravated already serious vulnerabilities and related patterns of trafficking in persons. What are some of the issues that you hope to pursue as the incoming Special Rapporteur? And could you comment specifically on the importance of skilling up humanitarian first responders in the identification of human trafficking dynamics within humanitarian settings? I think we heard from our previous speaker that maybe there's a bit of a gap there. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and delighted to be joining the webinar today. I think it's very timely, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to continue the cooperation also with the Refugee Law Project, given the work that the Refugee Law Project does on the ground in the field and the contact with communities most affected by forced displacement, and including human trafficking also. To pick up on the question, but also on some of the comments that were just made, it's interesting that today on the World Day Against Trafficking, the outgoing Special Rapporteur has taken the opportunity to issue a statement calling for a new approach to responses to human trafficking, and specifically highlighting the need to move beyond the limits of the Palermo Protocol, which does focus primarily on a criminal justice response. And she has called for and emphasized the importance of a human rights-based approach. Now, that is easy language to use, and I think we really need to unpick what does that mean, and what does that mean in a context of forced displacement? What does it mean for humanitarian actors? And what does it mean specifically in Uganda, which is one of the largest refugee hosting countries? One of the largest populations of refugees in the world is in Uganda. So what are the links between these situations of forced displacement, of refugee settlements and human trafficking, and how can we strengthen our responses and ensure that they are human rights based? And what is the significance of the current situation, the COVID-19 pandemic? We've already heard about the specific impacts of COVID-19 on victims of trafficking and survivors of trafficking. And here again, I think that's important in terms of thinking about the human rights-based approach, and it's something that the Refugee Law Project has always emphasized in its work, that the communities most affected should be taking a lead in determining the responses and in deciding on prevention measures and effective responses. So we do need a focus on survivor-led responses and ensuring that those most affected are involved in decision-making. And I know the National Action Plan on Trafficking has been launched this morning, earlier today in Uganda, and guidelines on the National Referral Mechanism. So that's very good to see that happening. But what I would ask is, to what extent are humanitarian actors involved here? We know that most of the concerns that are raised with regard to victims of trafficking, the vulnerabilities and risks, these relate to existing situations of extreme poverty, gender inequality, sexual and gender-based violence, a lack of fair and decent work and monitoring of labour recruitment processes. All of these are heightened and exacerbated in the context of the pandemic. And we have seen, as Rachel said, difficulties in terms of access to services, deployment elsewhere of law enforcement forces, loss of livelihoods with increased risk of poverty, and the potential for people to be forced into more exploitative work situations. The Special Rapporteur on Trafficking has issued a guidance note on COVID-19 and the links with human trafficking. The World Bank has highlighted the increasing numbers of people being pushed into extreme poverty, and particularly the risks for people in the informal sector who lack access to basic social protections, who are forced into risky and exploitative employment. And that is a particular concern in the Ugandan context. Also of concern is the situation of migrant domestic workers and domestic workers at home who are at heightened risk of exploitation and abuse, who may be more isolated from support and protection services and have no access often to legal protections. And that again increases risks of trafficking for the purpose of domestic servitude in the context of the lockdown. Specifically with regard to the response of UN agencies such as UNHCR, UNHCR has issued a number of guidance notes on sexual and gender-based violence encountered by women and girls, in particular in the context of COVID-19. They've highlighted the particular gendered impacts, the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic can affect people differently depending on age, gender, disability, or other diversity characteristics. And forcibly displaced women and girls are especially at risk during the pandemic of sexual and gender-based violence. Very little attention has been given specifically to human trafficking, but it tends to be incorporated, as was already said by FA, within the context of looking at sexual and gender-based violence responses and protection measures. But we also know that refugee and internally displaced women are more likely to hold precarious jobs in the informal sector. They're more likely to face disruptions in their livelihoods and income generating activities because of the pandemic. And going back to what Rachel said also about disruptions with regard to schooling and participation in schooling, we know that forcibly displaced adolescent girls face particular risks of disruption in terms of attending schooling and education and school dropouts, and also extra caregiving responsibilities during the pandemic. And Rachel has already mentioned concerns around increase in early and forced marriages being documented in the Ugandan context during the current period. And I think that is a very serious concern in the context of looking at the country's response to human trafficking. So also the movement restrictions which have been mentioned, again, that can lead to heightened risks of gender-based violence and intimate partner violence, as well as risks of sexual exploitation and abuse. And that is often linked then to human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, but also labour exploitation. And in the context of the lockdown, while we see more people moving online and the risks that that brings in particular in terms of child protection, we also see difficulties in terms of accessing information for those most at risk in the trafficking context, and greater isolation also. We know that UNHCR in Uganda has been working with UNFPA in terms of documenting sexual and gender-based violence, and has documented significant increases in incidences of sexual and gender-based violence in refugee settlements and in Kampala, with a number of areas particularly affected, Kawangwale and BDBD in particular reporting the highest rates. Now again, there isn't specific information given with regard to human trafficking, either for sexual exploitation or labour exploitation, so we don't know precisely what is happening here and what might be the links to the risks faced by people who are internally displaced or refugee communities. And again, I think that much more information needs to be coming through on this. There have been various protection responses, the use of hotlines, for example, not only in Uganda, but also in Rwanda and Kenya, use of community radio to sensitize communities on prevention and responses to sexual and gender-based violence. And again, we need to know whether that is also highlighting risks relating to human trafficking for a range of purposes. So again, a difficulty in terms of accessing that information and knowing precisely what has happened. UNHCR does have a range of tools available specifically focused on trying to identify as early as possible those at risk of trafficking and to ensure early referrals for protection. There are risk vulnerability tools, screening tools, There are some learnings and good practices that we know from other countries where these tools have been integrated into responses to forced displacement. So I think we need to know a lot more about what is happening in the Ugandan context, how these are being put in place, and whether there is effective access to protection, and how is the pandemic impacting on access to those kinds of protection services. The other difficulty in terms of what we know about sexual and gender-based violence, and this is something that has been highlighted in the work of the Refugee Law Project, is that this tends to focus on women and girls who are particularly at risk, but it does sometimes mean that we have a blind spot or a gap in terms of knowing what is happening with regard to trafficking concerning men and boys, including those who are internally displaced and in refugee communities. What's happening with regard to sexual exploitation and labour exploitation in the agricultural sector, perhaps in the hospitality sector. What's the role of the transport sector in perhaps facilitating or assisting trafficking networks, but also the important role that they can play in prevention and reporting. So there needs to be much more work in terms of partnerships with civil society, with humanitarian actors, and with the private sector to ensure that we have early, timely, and effective responses that are human rights based.
Thank you very much indeed, Siobhán, and for giving us that insight, and again emphasizing the multiple ways in which the vulnerabilities have been increased, and also for highlighting the existence of a number of guidelines, screening tools, and the like. I suppose the question must be, and maybe I can push this one back to Rachel as we wait for people to write their questions and answers in the question and answer function. But beginning with Rachel, how do you connect with the humanitarian sector as DPP? Do you connect, and if so, how? Is it through the office of the Prime Minister, or what is the way in which you get into those field settings and those refugee settlements? The largest one is Bidi Bidi, then we have Naki Valley, we have Changwali, we have a whole number of them. And I'm wondering, what are the specific mechanisms you have to get information about human trafficking within those settlement areas, which host the vast majority of refugees in Uganda? Rachel.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. I must say that the Office of the DPP enjoys great coordination with the other government agencies and then also civil society organizations. We do work closely with the Office of the Prime Minister, and in case of issues of exploitation or trafficking among the refugees, we get first-hand information from them. But even then, we do work together with police. And because we embraced prosecution-led investigation as a mode of being effective in our work, usually when reports are made by the refugees of any form of exploitation, whether pertaining to human trafficking or SGBV, reports made to police, usually police brings us on board at the earliest. So through prosecution-led investigations, then we get to the various camps or wherever the victim of trafficking is, and we make the necessary assessments, and where possible, if there's any referral, we advise on the referrals, on the referral pathways to be taken. But that's how we get on point. We don't wait. In the past, we used to wait in our office and wait for police files to be compiled, evidence compiled and brought to us. But we do now go onto the ground. We go to the victims. We go to police. We reach out to various civil society organizations, and the public can easily access us. So we also have a complaints desk that receives complaints from all over, from anyone, from the victims, or whoever detects crime. So when they get to us, then that's how we access the various victims of trafficking or any other offense.
So would you, not the exact figure perhaps, but do you have a sense of how many of the 300 cases that you mentioned that are under investigation currently, how many of those relate to refugee populations?
what I can say that of the 300 cases under investigation, most of them pertain to sexual exploitation. About 210 are for sexual exploitation. And then the others fall into the various forms of exploitation, like we have human sacrifice that has been also rampant. We have, we've registered an increase in child marriages and forced marriages as well. So we have so far registered only 2 cases, as that is as per June, pertaining to refugees.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much. And maybe the first question from the audience that I think probably should start with you, if I may. What measures have been put in place for victims of trafficking and forced labor migration returning to Uganda from the Middle East during the pandemic? You mentioned that there have been repatriation flights. Is there anything you can add to that?
Yes, besides the government repatriating some of the victims of trafficking, the Uganda Police Force has a center, particularly to address issues of human trafficking at the international airport. And the procedure now is that when victims are repatriated after the 14, I think it's the 14 mandatory quarantine days, then after getting their clearance from the Ministry of Health, they get in touch with the law enforcement officers. Of course, the challenge now is that the various civil society organizations are not taking in victims of trafficking that need shelter because of the fear of contamination. So that is the current challenge now. But if they are cleared, police contacts the various civil society organizations, or we make referrals to whatever organization is available to take in victims of trafficking, depending on their immediate needs. And then that is how the process begins. That is when police begins the investigations, and that is when the need for their support, whether be it psychosocial support or counseling, or maybe shelter their agents need, that is when it's addressed. That's when their needs get to be addressed. But at the moment, they have to first finish their 14 days quarantine period, get their certificates, and then get in touch with the law enforcement officers that are based at the airport to take information, to open up police files. So it is after the police has opened up police files that we are also going to come on board and see what other intervening measures that we can come up with.
Thank you very much. I see another interesting question coming in, which maybe Eefje, you would like to have a stab at, which is around the role of civil society in having a fresh look at the Palermo Protocol and the introduction of new approaches. So I think that Professor Siobhán had mentioned that the outgoing Special Rapporteur has called for some new approaches. How do we get civil society involved properly in that discussion, in your view?
I think we have had a very good opportunity to actually engage with the former or outgoing Special Rapporteur to discuss what is needed. So there were a few webinars actually that were accessible to the wider public that actually led to the recommendations that she made and also that I mentioned today. And I think for the further process, we should actually look at our new Special Rapporteur, because actually now it is also up to her and her mandate to see whether she's taking this process on, and hopefully with the same engagement with civil society as what we had before. But
maybe I can ask Siobhán to take over the baton from you on that. Because there are a couple of questions here which I think also speak to your mandate. One is about, in a way, is a restatement of my question about your priorities. What will you be focusing on as a Special Rapporteur, and how will you take the pandemic itself and trafficking in the context of the pandemic into account? And the other question was a broader question about how do we sensitize the public about trafficking, because we all, I'm sure, are aware of traffickers who persuade people with all sorts of stories and end up trafficking them. What mechanisms do you see as, or processes do you see as important for sensitizing the public? Siobhán.
Thank you very much. I'll maybe start with that one. In terms of sensitizing the public, I think that's hugely important to raise awareness and to reach out to wider groups, you know, beyond the kind of usual suspects, if you like. So to use a whole range of media, social media, online, but also depending on the context, depending on the location, community radio can be very effective, for example, other kinds of communication. So I think really using whatever kinds of communications are appropriate to the local context. And also going beyond the usual stereotypes. So we tend to have a very particular stereotypical view of who might be a victim of trafficking and who's at risk. And it needs to be broadened out much more so that we can recognize that perhaps men and boys may be at risk, that isn't something always identified, that we link in with humanitarian actors and refugee settlements also, and that it's not overlooked, and that we look at the labor context as well as the sexual context. So to move beyond the kind of easier stereotypes and look more closely, I think. One thing I would like to mention in response to the question about people returning to Uganda or elsewhere who have been identified, who've been referred for protection, we know that that's not the end of the story, that there are very serious risks of re-trafficking. So unless you have longer term, not just investigations and prosecutions, but social protection measures, you have supports in place in terms of access to employment and protection from those networks that are still there. We know from listening to civil society, from listening to NGOs, that after a few months, often those who have been returned, who have been identified as victims of trafficking, are again re-trafficked because they don't find meaningful employment, because they're back into situations of extreme poverty, that they don't have long-term protection measures in place in terms of safe accommodation or alternatives. So NGOs, civil society have very limited resources. We know that the shelters available have limited space. They can often only work on short-term basis. So we really need to be looking at longer-term social protection measures and meaningful supports on return, so it doesn't become this kind of vicious cycle. And there's also a concern that it's often local communities or families that may have been involved. So what protection measures are in place in relation to those risks that remain? In relation to the priorities for the mandate, for my mandate as Special Rapporteur, I will be engaging in consultation on those with civil society. There has already been a significant kind of mapping or setting out of gaps in terms of where we are in responding to human trafficking, and a lot of work has been done in reflecting on the 20th anniversary of the Palermo Protocol. And I think a key thing has to be to ensure that we don't end up with a kind of fatigue of talking about the same things, and that we really do integrate responses to human trafficking into wider discussions around human rights, including social justice and socioeconomic inequalities, really looking at those in a meaningful way, combating labour exploitation. What does that really mean in terms of decent work, cooperation with those organisations working in that field? What does it mean in terms of effective prevention mechanisms and tackling those, but really integrating it into the wider human rights-based response will be an immediate priority. The COVID-19 pandemic, all of the UN, there are immediate heightened risks, I think, that have already been mentioned. But also much of what is happening is really exacerbating existing inequalities around the informal economy, gaps in social protection, limited resourcing of child protection services, and more effective responses, both law enforcement, but also in terms of decent work, access to schooling, gender equality. So those were existing problem areas. Their heightened or light has been shone on them in the context of the pandemic. And we need to ensure that we're ready to respond in a meaningful way to the risks of human trafficking.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think the issue of sensitizing the public is not just about the people who are at risk of being trafficked, but also their families and so on, and the people receiving trafficked persons who get sent back. I think I was reading just the other day about people who've been trafficked from West Africa, and then they get back and their families stigmatize them for having failed to make it in Europe. So I think there are many dimensions to the awareness raising as well.
Yeah, even the traffickers. I mean, we also have stereotypes as to those who recruit or those who are involved in the trafficking cycle, which also create situations where you simply trust an elderly couple who will promise you work abroad while they are part of, because you feel that they are trustworthy. So we also have some typical stereotypes about how traffickers look like and how you are approached.
Okay. I'm seeing many questions coming in now. There's an interesting one here which speaks to I think in this debate, we tend to get caught between the socioeconomic factors, the push and the pull that migration experts talk about, and the legal responses. And here is a question about, despite all the socioeconomic issues, what about well-capacitated law enforcement? And doesn't that need to be part of the response? And the question was, how do the panelists, and I would like this question to go to Rachel, if I may, see the capacity of the police in Uganda, but also generally, to identify, investigate, and charge perpetrators of human trafficking? And additionally, in particular, what is the capacity for cyber investigations, given that a lot of trafficking work is done and coordinated online? So Rachel, I think I've heard it said that Uganda at some time has been like a supermarket for passports. So they are suggesting that there are some issues within the systems as well. Could you speak a bit to this question about the law enforcement? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So currently we work hand in hand with the Uganda Police Force in investigating cases of trafficking. They are the lead investigating agency. We only come on board to support them during the prosecution-led investigations. However, I must say that we continue to build the capacity of not only police officers, but also prosecutors and the judges who are in the criminal justice system. We've embarked on various trainings, specialized trainings with police to build their capacity, especially in investigating trafficking, given that it's a very unique offense. It's an organized crime, as we all know. And in addition to the trainings, we've come up with a prosecution-led trafficking in persons investigations manual to assist the police and the prosecutors in the course of the investigations. And we also came up with an offense charging manual to help in accurate drafting of charges with the Uganda police. So our capacity to investigate online human trafficking, or given, most especially it manifests in online child sexual exploitation, is rather limited. But I know some police officers have been trained to investigate in the cyber area. We even have a department in the Uganda Police Force that is dedicated to conducting those investigations. But I must say that building capacity is something that we have to do continuously, because police officers and prosecutors who work in the public service are always transferable. So that means we have to take the path of training all, and then specializing, such that even if some officers are transferred, we don't leave a gap in the area. And then on the second issue of Uganda being a supermarket of passports, that's a bit, yeah, well, I must say that in the past, some traffickers have been using false documentation to traffic, to traffic Ugandan girls and boys. But what the passport office has done, that's immigration, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, is they've introduced the e-passports. So e-passports are meant to do away with the various forgeries that have been done in the past. And beginning January 2021, the whole country is going to be using e-passports. So they are phasing out the old passports that were easily, that were easy to forge. But again, what we know is that traffickers not only use false documentation, they use various means of either deception, they groom the victims, coercion, and whatever forms they can to lure the victims into a trafficking situation. So it is something that still has to go ahead with raising awareness. Like Professor Siobhán said, we have to keep on raising awareness, let people know what trafficking is. And this also includes also popularizing our Trafficking in Persons Act. It's been in existence for 10 years, but not all stakeholders know about this act, So it's mostly to raise awareness and for people to know the dangers of trafficking, and also know that trafficking is real, such that it's not about only maybe using false documentation or deception or coercion, but for them to be well informed. Of course, in addition to other, issues like having a social security protection for people to get employment, to get what to do at home, to address the push factors.
Maybe, thank you very much, Rachel. Maybe, Siobhán, you could speak a bit to the kind of labor recruitment agencies and where do they sit in this nexus between, the justified search for employment and then getting tricked into fake employment, which turns out to be a trafficking situation. Could you speak a bit to that? We've even had one participant talking about arguing that most of the labor exporting companies are owned by state officials or close associates. So is there another bit of the jigsaw puzzle that you will need to be looking at as special rapporteur there in terms of the relationship between state actors and labor agencies that can sometimes be maybe a cover for trafficking operations?
Yes, this is a hugely important. Labor recruitment agencies are key actors in particularly in countries such as Uganda, where you have externalization policies, labor externalization policies, promoting employment opportunities abroad at state level. Here, licensing and monitoring of recruitment agencies is absolutely critical to ensure that they are working to provide decent work, that they are providing contracts of employment, that there is protection for workers on arrival, that these are meaningful job opportunities, and that these recruitment pathways are not covers for trafficking networks. So how recruitment agencies are licensed and monitored is absolutely critical. And also there should be accountability in terms of where there have been incidents of trafficking or other forms of labor exploitation. And the ILO and IOM have been doing quite a bit of work in this area. You have the International Recruitment Integrity System, the IRIS standard, which links in human rights instruments and labour standards, including the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the DACA Principles for Migration with Dignity, and various examples of best practices. And there's an IRIS certification scheme that has been developed also. So absolutely the role of recruitment agencies is critical, but also how they are licensed, how they're monitored. Are they genuinely certified and recognized? if there are links with state officials, that is something that needs to be looked at. Any kind of involvement of state officials or government officials in a trafficking context, of course, is an aggravated form of trafficking and should attract higher sanctions. But overall, the kind of licensing, monitoring, the practices of recruitment agencies, these are critical. There are model contracts in place. I know there have been bilateral agreements entered into between Uganda and a number of countries. And again, how are those enforced? What is the oversight? What provisions are in place to ensure that the contracts being offered are genuine, provide decent work, provide protection for workers, including in sectors such as domestic work and construction, which are very much high risk, but also hospitality sectors. So yes, this is a critical question to be looked at.
Can I just ask you there to comment a bit? As Special Rapporteur, I believe the idea is that you make 2 trips per year to 2 different specific country contexts. Where in your travels do the regional blocks fit? So when do you look at the East African Community or SADC and so on? Because as you say, there are bilateral arrangements for monitoring of labor externalization, but how do the regional blocks go about it? And is that do you have a space in those blocks, or is that a different conversation, another silo?
No, I think that's something that needs to be looked at. The country visits are very much country specific. That's how they have been undertaken to date. And there's quite a process of negotiation to get an invitation to arrange the visit. Not all countries want to be subject to a monitoring process. But I think it will be critically important to engage with regional bodies, because they have a key role to play in terms of ensuring decent migration pathways as free movement expands in the African context, also ensuring that can be used as a way to ensure access to decent work, but also protection against exploitation. The outgoing Special Rapporteur, Maria Grazia, did engage in a number of regional consultations as part of her work. And I think the regional human rights organizations, the regional economic entities, these are key partners, really. And I think there's a lot more work that could be done here to strengthen the effectiveness of Special Rapporteur's mandate, particularly in the context of migration and trafficking. There is a special representative on migration within the African Union. Each of the regional blocks also have particular instruments on human trafficking and free movement. And these will be important to engage with, I think, because they're cross-border issues, but they are also internal issues. So it's important not to lose sight of both elements. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor. There's a question here about reparations. Maybe we could send that one to Eefje to pick up on that question. What reparations are available if you've been a victim? You've told us we should be victim-centered, we should take a human rights-based approach. Where do reparations for being trafficked fit into that? And what steps are in place, do you know?
So when we think of reparations, you see that they're mostly within the context of criminal proceedings. So the problem is that there, because many cases do not make it to court at all, and victims do not come forward, they do not have access to reparations at all. There have been countries where there are state funds where you can get compensation even if you are not within criminal proceedings, but this is still fairly limited. There have been some international funds also established to offer some reparations, but actually, and this is, I think, again, a bit more of the consequences of the criminal justice approach, is that you really have to go through this criminal justice proceedings before you will get recognition, and also recognition in compensation actually for what has happened to you. And this is quite problematic because also in many cases where you do have compensation awarded, you see that there are compensation orders, but you have to go after, or well, the perpetrator has to pay these. and in many instances you may have the court order, but it doesn't actually result in the compensation being paid actually. So you have certain countries where you do have possibilities that the state actually pays for the compensation and goes after the perpetrator. You see it in the Netherlands, for example. But in most cases, victims, even when they have, when there is a successful trafficking case and the perpetrator has been convicted, and there is a compensation order, that in the end they do not have access to it. So this is really something, and if you look at the feeling of justice being done, then it's, for victims, it's mostly about recognition and having some form of reparation, be it in monetary funds or support. So it's a very important area that we are trying to push for.
Okay, thank you very much for that. That's I think an important insight and an important component of the whole conversation. Rachel, one very fast last word from you before you go. I know you're rushing to your next appointment on NVS.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you to the Irish Centre for putting all this together. We believe through having many of these dialogues, we can sensitize many people about human trafficking and let them know that human trafficking is real and it's affecting Uganda just like it is affecting the world globally. We are dedicated, we as the Office of the DPP are dedicated to fighting human trafficking because we believe we are among the first responders. And we believe we've also taken on a victim-centered approach to ensure that we combat human trafficking through prosecuting the offenders, but also ensuring that the victims of trafficking and the survivors of trafficking also get necessary protection and support that we can accord them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's been really fantastic having you with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris.
Eefje, a quick last word.
Well, I also want to thank all the attendees. I think there are still many questions that are left unanswered, so hopefully there is a way of actually continuing the debate and making these answers heard, because this is the way in how we actually move the trafficking field forward. Yeah, I'm very happy with this opportunity, and I wish particularly our new UN Special Rapporteur good luck with the heavy task that is on her shoulders, because we expect a lot, and yeah.
Well, thank you very much. It's been fantastic having you with us as well. And as you say, there are so many dimensions for the Special Rapporteur to be tackling. I don't know how you're going to capture it all during your mandate, but perhaps you'd like to, just for those people who submitted questions that were not addressed, our apologies for that. The time is quite limited and we wanted to keep to our time, but we do have your emails, so we shall be sending out any answers, any questions we've not addressed. We shall ask our panelists if they have any thoughts, and then we shall email those out. So with that said, Siobhán, would you like to give us a closing remark?
Yeah, just to say thank you very much to Refugee Law Project. Thank you very much to co-panelists, to Eefje and to Rachel in particular, and to all the participants. I can see the questions coming in. I think there are really important points being highlighted in the discussion, and I think it's critical that we do engage with organisations on the ground in the field, and with regional blocks, as Chris mentioned, also to try to ensure that human rights responses are integrated into the discussions on human trafficking, and to ensure effective prevention mechanisms and effective access to protection. And that will be critical, that we hear different voices, that we hear voices of those on the ground, and that we hear from survivors and those communities most affected, so that we're not all operating in silos, and that the range of risks of exploitation and also the responsibilities on a range of different actors are recognised. So I'll certainly, in the course of my mandate, I hope to continue working with you and with other organisations on the ground and in the field to strengthen the impact of that human rights response. So.
Thank you very much, Siobhán, and thank you once again to the whole panel. I think we're all feeling very fortunate to be able to work with you, Professor, and we shall do whatever we can to support you in your mandate and that commitment to work with many different stakeholders in this very complex issue. So with that, I want to thank you once again, all of you, and all the more than 60 participants. We've really appreciated your engagement today, and we shall continue the conversation by email and subsequent dialogue.